So yes, hello. My name is Daniel. Uh, I used to be part of MonSec, not really anymore since I graduated. Jumped out and got a graduate role. And so this this week I'm sort of going to be going over the 10 lessons I've sort of learned over the last 10 months actually being in the industry, and hopefully sharing some knowledge with you guys that would help you when you guys do get into the industry yourself, start off a bit quicker than I did. These are the hurdles that I hit. Maybe when you guys get into the industry, you can avoid them. Sort of a nice foil to last week, if I remember correctly. You guys had like the high exec sort of, here's how the industry works. This is sort of the complement lower down. This is how it works on the ground. So before we get in, for those of you who don't know me, like I said before, my name's Daniel. I started in MonSec back in 2018, competed in 2018 CySCA, RIP CySCA. That was a cybersecurity challenge made by the Australian government, of all people, that I don't think has actually run since. We ended up actually making our own down under CTF. So if anyone's into CTFs, that's coming up in like September 26th, I believe. So have a look out for that. I was there when MonSec became an official club. I became vice president of MonSec in 2020. What a year to decide to do that. At the end of 2020, I graduated, and I'm now working for a company called Message Media, which is the largest telecom you've never heard of. Some other highlights. I made the logo that you guys use for MonSec, so if nothing else, remember me for that, please. Let's just get into it. Before, sort of the first big idea to get your head around when jumping into the cybersecurity industry is that the cybersecurity industry is its own whole beast. Like, you know how you have developers, you have like QA testers, you have managers, all that sort of stuff. You have very defined roles, and within those defined roles, it like the moment you actually step into studying one of those things, you're like, oh, it's just a lake. I can just step in, and then suddenly you're falling down into like the depths of the Mariana Trench. That's sort of how cybersecurity is. So I thought I'd jump into the industry and just be like, I'm going to be a security person. And then people started asking me, all right, so what do you want to do? Security. All right, but what part of security? Security. And that's sort of been that was sort of my answer for the first 3 months of being in the industry, of just, what do you mean? Security is its own subject, right? Like in university, you have the security subjects. Little did I know, actually looking into it, cybersecurity is a massive like iceberg of its own. This is a mind map I got off LinkedIn, of all places, which sort of shows the key areas of cybersecurity. And keep in mind, this is by no means an exhaustive list. This is the mind map of one guy, and every organization is different. You will have different roles, you will have different responsibilities. Nothing is the same. But the sort of key areas being physical security, career, that's sort of your OSCP, OSWE, OffSec sort of certificate stuff, architecture. There's a lot of frameworks. People really like frameworks in security. Application security, risk assessment, enterprise, governance, threat intelligence, which is actually really fun. That's sort of the nation state, sort of malware campaigns, all the stuff you hear about in the news. One that is near and dear to my heart, given MonSec, user education, and security operations. Those very often, and if you get into a big company like EY or Telstra or anything like that, these will all be their own domains. If you get into a relatively like small to medium-sized business like I did, you will be touching a little bit on each of these. So it's good to get an idea of like what is out there, just because you may run into it or you may be forced into running into it. So that was sort of the first big idea. But the first lesson that I learned, at least, and also that I reached out to a couple of other graduate friends and they echoed the same idea, is don't be afraid to ask for help. Something you'll find, especially if you go into the industry certificates, and especially the biggest conveyor of this is offensive security and OSCP and OSWE and all those sort of, those really good certs. They parrot this idea of try harder, and they parrot this idea as sort of, if you're not understanding something, just research more, just look at it more, just go and figure it out yourself. Because figuring it out yourself, especially in security, is a really helpful and really beneficial way of learning. Because if you don't, the idea is if people just tell you, you're going to learn how to do it that one time, but you're not going to have the knowledge to then go back and expand upon it or anything like that. And that is really good. That is a good mindset to have, but it's only good to a point. I think it was after beating my head against like trying to figure out what was going wrong in a system for, I think it was like a week and a half sort of thing. I finally decided to give in and just ask like a friend who had nothing to do with the system. He was just in a completely different part of the business. And he was able to answer my question in about 10 minutes. So even if you don't ask the people that are necessarily closest to what you're working on, even if you just ask someone, there is a very high likelihood that one, they will want to help, and there is a slightly less, but still likely that they will have some idea of how to help you, or at least point you in the right direction. Lesson 2 was sort of related to lesson 1, and that is that there's always more things to learn. You're never the smartest one in the room, especially in a graduate role. You may go from being in the sort of highest levels of university, or you may get the best score in the class or whatever. But the moment you get into the industry, there's always going to be someone smarter than you. Even if you're the smartest on one particular topic, walk into the next room, start talking about something else, and you're suddenly the dumbest one in the room. So that kind of feeds into the whole remember to ask for help, because everyone else is smart as well. Everyone else is, it's good to think of just everyone else is smarter than you, and learn from that and actually use other people's expertise to help your own. A really good thing to do when you're actually trying to learn from other people is just ask if they want to go get a coffee. Hey, I see that you did this thing on a system. I don't quite understand it. Do you mind catching up for a coffee and explaining it to me? Suddenly, that's only 15 minutes, but you've started to talk to that person now. And so it's going to be easier next time to go back and be like, hey, what's this? Or hey, how do I do this thing? And suddenly they'll be more likely to give you their time, and they'll also give you more useful information the more you go back to them, partially because they will start to actually sort of preempt what you're about to ask them, because they know where your gaps are. It's kind of like half having a mentor, but not quite. So just remember you're not the smartest one in the room, and feed off other people's knowledge as well. Especially if you go into blue team, lesson 3 really applies, which is if you learn stakeholder management. And what I mean by that is learn what people want and learn why people behave the way they do. Cybersecurity is a very technical industry, and it's very easy to get, stuck into a book and learn the ins and outs of how Exchange works and how the stack interacts if you do this thing. And it's very technical. It's a lot of documentation. This is something you can't really learn from documentation, but is so very crucial to security. People won't, as much as it may annoy you, people won't do security for security's sake. Either they don't think it's an issue, they agree it's an issue, but they don't think they have time, or just they won't do it because they're only there for the paycheck, and it's not affecting their KPI, so what's it to them if the business gets ransomware? So learn what people want, and learn more specifically how you can help them get it. Because if someone isn't doing something because there's a particular blocker, like they may, if you just leave it and you say, hey, there's an issue, and just leave it at that, they're gonna say, all right, cool, I'll fix it, and then not touch it for 6 months. But if you say, hey, there's an issue, do you mind fixing it? And they say, yeah, I'll get to it eventually. And you're like, well, okay, you said eventually. What sort of time frame is that? And they're like, 6 months. Why is it 6 months? Because I have this, this, and this to do. Well, okay. Suddenly, you know that they have these things to do. What if you could help them with that? Maybe there's something in that list that you can, talk to someone else and get it sped up, get them to help you speed it up, or just removing stuff from people's plates so that they can help you more. I don't know if that was a good explanation of it, but Google Stakeholder Management, I'm sure there's some sort of self-help guru out there willing to teach it to you, or just be mindful of it when you actually get into the industry, and you'll tend to start picking it up pretty quickly if you're actively thinking about it. Lesson 4, and this is particularly if you're going onto the red team side of things, not so much the blue team, but document everything. It still applies to blue team, but the main reason I say document everything is that way no one can tell you that you're wrong, because you have proof that it is an issue. So a great example of this was one of my friends was doing an engagement on a red team engagement, trying to hack into a company. And they found this really critical bug that allowed them to, one, get into the network, and then secondly, due to a misconfiguration within the network, they could pretty much get straight up to domain admin, which is like God mode. Because they were so focused on and then I could do this to get domain admin, and then proving that they had domain admin, the initial step, which was very small and they didn't think really mattered, they skimped out on the documentation. And then when they actually went to the client to actually say, hey, this is an issue, this is how I did it, the client just didn't believe them. And they got very defensive. And they did eventually talk them around and actually get them to understand that, yes, this is an issue, and yes, this is how you can do it. But that was a lot more effort than it needed to be, purely because they didn't document everything initially. And because they didn't document everything initially, it allowed for the client to get defensive, and then suddenly, it became 10 times as much work to actually just do something that was going to always happen anyway. on the blue team side of things, I've experienced this in my own job. Just because if you don't document everything from a blue teamer's perspective, it makes it all, it makes it a lot harder to actually get an issue fixed. Not because people will get defensive, whilst that still happens and they don't believe you that this is an issue. More so I've had it just because people won't know how to fix it. People won't actually, like, okay, developers are the ones making things. Like, and they're very often not educated in what security issues are. So if you say to them, hey, you have an XSS on your site, maybe like 6 times out of 10, you'll get someone who knows what XSS is. But those other 4 times, they'll be like, all right, cool, that's a security issue, I'll fix it. And then they'll just kind of stay there stunned. So if you document everything and you give them a working POC, even if they don't know what XSS is, or even if they've never seen it before, they can plug that into the website, and then they can use their debug tools and everything to start, working back to try and figure out what the actual issue is. Yeah, so remember, as much documentation as possible. It also means that if you don't, it also means that if people don't listen to you, you have more like leverage to talk to like other people around them and be like, hey, can you do this as well? Or can you do this instead? Or, go to the manager. But lesson 5, impact isn't everything. And this is particularly true if you're doing anything to do with bug bounties. So as part of my job, I do a lot of the incident response. And as part of incident response, we occasionally get bug bounty like reports. I forgot the word there for a second. We occasionally get bug bounty reports, and they'll be saying, hey, this is a super critical issue. And they'll generally overestimate how dangerous their exploit actually is. And most of the time, the reason they do that is because they put too much emphasis on the impact of it and what it can actually do. So if this exploit happens, this is what I can do with that exploit. And they'll get into a system and they'll be like, oh, this is critical. What they don't understand, and why there's very often a divide between blue teams and red teams, or blue teams and bug bounty hunters, is that blue teams also have to take into account the likelihood of something happening. So yes, you can get into this system, and yes, you can like get a customer, you can take over a customer's account, but only if the customer is set up in this particular way, only if these flags are set on the customer's account. And suddenly, if it applied to any customer, yes, that would definitely be a critical. But that collection of configurations only really applies to like this this particular subgroup of users who like got migrated from another account, from another system or something like that. And suddenly, instead of 100 million users, you've got like 1,000. And maybe that isn't as critical to the blue team as it seems to the bug bounty hunter. So yeah, even if you don't work in blue team, even if you're just doing bug bounty stuff, please remember impact and remember the likelihood as well as the impact. You'll often see this in like risk management charts or frameworks. And yeah, that's likely what the blue team is using. And the blue team is the one who's actually paying you. So good to know how they think. Lesson 6 is that user education is probably the most powerful tool you have. And admittedly, kind of biased, given that I did a lot of these sort of MonSec presentations throughout my time with MonSec. But I've I believe that back when I was making the presentations for MonSec, and I still believe it actually jumping into the workforce, because most of the time, if you give a team or if you give some developers a vulnerability and say, hey, can you fix this? This is how you should fix this. And you give them that POC. Yes, they can go and they can debug it and they can fix it. But very often, if you do that and you leave it at that, it will be just, they fix it, they figure out exactly what's happening for that POC, and then they'll close it. But the underlying issue is still there. They'll look at it as an edge case to close off, not as an actual issue. So one of the biggest parts of my job is just trying to educate people on having that security mindset, on having that, oh, but what if this happened instead? Another thing you'll find is that developers are very like, I like to describe them as goal-oriented. Because they have like this functionality that they have to implement by this deadline. They have to do this before this deadline. They have to make sure that this file format becomes this file format. And it's a lot about specifications for them. So when you actually talk to them about security issues, particularly things around like deserialization and things about like when one piece of data can be misinterpreted as another piece of data, it's generally really hard for them to understand that, just because that's not a way that they know that they inherently think about things, or at least that's not a way that they have been trying to think about things for the last however many years of being a developer. So majority of the time, to actually close a vulnerability like entirely, you not only have to provide them with all of the information and be as helpful as you can, but you also need to educate them on how to actually have that security mindset and how to actually think about how this pattern even occurred in the first place, so that they can avoid it in future. If you do end up getting into a blue team or like even red team, and you want to actually see this in action, I highly recommend getting a bunch of colleagues together and just doing like a 20-30 minute presentation exactly like this, exactly like MonSec, on a particular topic you think is an issue within the network, and just talk to them afterwards and see their reactions. Because the moment you educate people on what the problem is and why the underlying problem occurs, then they start to actually see it a lot more besides that one instance of it. Lesson 7 is that everything is misconfigured. And when I say everything is misconfigured. A lot of corporate networks have been built in a way that they were put together back in the 90s or back in the early 2000s. They were built by a contractor who they didn't really have the money to hire full time, so they were in for 6 months, they put it together, and then they left. Very often not giving them documentation, but it's fine because it's been working for the last 10 years. Now the business is bigger, now the business has more money, so they've decided to actually hire a sysadmin. And so the sysadmin is going in, and very often, if it's their first time in that sort of role, they'll do the best that they think they can. But there'll be things that the contractor did 10 years ago because it was best practice 10 years ago, but it's not so best practice now, that they don't entirely understand. And then that sysadmin will just leave it, because if they try and do anything with it, the entire system falls over. So they leave it, and they say they'll learn and they'll do it better. They'll do it better when they have more idea of what's going on in the network. But whilst they're doing that, they are continually adding to the network themselves, and then they are adding more and more complexity. and then they will maybe go back and they'll actually understand what's going wrong now, and they'll try and fix it, and then everything will fall over again, including all of their added complexity. And even if they fix the original bug, now all their complexity is broken as well. So very often it's just left until that person quits, and then a new person comes in who has the original design, which is all broken, but also this whole other stuff that's been built on top of that, which is also reliant and is also broken. And that happens constantly. And when I say constantly, I mean, depending on the type of company you have, you can get the same you can get a new sysadmin like every 5 years or so. Company loyalty is at an all-time low in human history. So don't expect the companies you guys work for to be the same as your mom and dad's, where the same sysadmin has been there for 20 years. They will eventually move on, and then all of their little like complexities that they knew exactly how to deal with will be forgotten to time, and the next person who comes in will just accept that that's how it is, and maybe not even realize that there are those little bits of complexity throughout. What this leads to is that systems become extremely complex, especially on the enterprise side of things. If you want a really good example of this, look into the documentation of Active Directory and actually try and understand something about it. I know Peter did a presentation on this either early this semester or late last semester. I would probably have a guess that he only touched the tip of the iceberg, because there is no way you could learn Active Directory in an hour, let alone a week, let alone a year. It is a system that has many developers come through and has been building on top of it, on top of it, on top of it. And so when they all leave Microsoft, the new bunch come in, they build it up, and then suddenly there's a bunch of technical debt that you can't change because suddenly every organization in the world is using it. So internal systems and enterprise systems are very, very complex. And so nobody knows how they work. Everything is misconfigured. And that is the biggest problem that blue teamers face. It also helps red teamers, because it means that if you're on the red team side of things, the moment you get your foot in the door, most of the work is already done for you by these misconfigurations, and most of the lateral movement happens within a corporate network by Active Directory misconfigurations. So silver lining, I guess. Lesson 8 is that most attacks can be stopped by the simplest of controls. Namely, please, for the love of God, use MFA. These are sort of the little things that you the little things like MFA, like, you know, not allowing exchange, like not allowing internal servers to be on the internet, actually enforcing good firewall perimeters, that sort of stuff. All the sort of stuff that, you know, you assume that every company would have already done because they've been around. Surely they know what they're doing. If a company slips up, it's going to be slipping up in these particular ways. And it's going to be slipping up in the simplest of ways. And there is a very good explanation for that. And that is because everyone assumes everyone else knows what they're doing when it comes to the simple stuff. When you come to complex stuff and, you know, machine learning and antivirus and all that sort of stuff, you have multiple people looking over the work, and it's generally a massive project and they can do all these sort of things. And so those get built to specification, and people will notice if it's not to specification. The simple stuff, though, people will just kind of set it up once and assume it's right there. But then let's take MFA for instance. Everyone gets MFA in this hypothetical company, but then a developer's like, oh, but I need access from a different location, and the MFA is geo-based. Like you're using Google, and Google like does some analytics on your location and says if this is a risky sign-in, can you just turn it off for me while I'm on holiday? And then IT says no, and then the guy can't work, and then the manager comes back and is like, we need to turn this off, and so it gets turned off. And so then then the guy logs in, he doesn't have MFA, it's only for 2 weeks, it's fine. 2 weeks ends, they suddenly he's back into the office, he forgets to mention it because I mean it's working for him anyway. Security team doesn't notice because they've been told to turn it off and ignore it for now. They're busy doing something else. And then suddenly, if this happens more and more and more, you have a whole bunch of people that don't have a very simple control in place, but no one's looking at it because they think that it's in place, and nobody is paying attention to it. Not saying that this has actually happened to me, but this is just a fictitious example of what could go wrong and why the simple stuff is always the problem. Yeah, that's all I really have to say on that one. Lesson 9, and this is a really big one, especially if you don't go the sort of penetration tester route and you go into the blue team. And blue team is probably the I think it's like 2/3 of cybersecurity is in blue team as opposed to like 1/3 of red team, or it's skewed in some way. So more than likely, if you go into security, you'll be going into blue team. And so one thing to learn really quick, really early, is that blue team is just another word for risk management. Red teaming is all about, finding the clink in the armor. If I hit this one particular port in this way, I can then get into the system as a low privilege user. I can privilege escalate to root. I can use that to abuse a trust between two systems to laterally move. And, it's one particular problem after the next that you chain together to get in. Blue team is theoretically there to stop those chains from happening. And they are, making sure that there is no hole in the armor anywhere. But that's not possible. I'll tell you this straight up. It is impossible to always make sure that there is no problems anywhere in the network. There will always be, some esoteric version that someone forgot to update, or that the system is meant to auto update but it didn't, or a lot of little things running around. And the sheer size of these networks, because they are meant to be automated, and they are what entire businesses are built on top of, so they're going to be complex. There's a lot of moving parts, and you may only be like one in maybe a team of like 10, 15, 20 security people, if you're lucky, in an organization of maybe 200 developers. Though that math doesn't quite work out. And so a lot of what you'll be doing in blue team is just trying to figure out what you can do to have the largest effect with the least amount of effort. And you'll be trying to polish the largest area, without killing yourself, basically. And so another way to think about that is your job isn't to get rid of the risk. Your job is just to manage the risk. It's just to make sure that it's less likely to occur. And that, I think, was one of the biggest context switch that I had to do a couple months into my grad position. And finally, the last lesson I'll leave you guys with is that one way, the best way to think about security as an industry is that security best practice is the IT or the developer's best practice. If everyone did everything perfectly, then there would be no technical debt, there would be no security issues, but no one is perfect. And if you've done anything to do with software development, you know for a fact that technical debt will eventually stack up. Security is just a more aggressive and more formal way of dealing with technical debt. One way to see this in action is that just look at the amount of vulnerabilities and look at the amount of issues that you'll see that are particularly around legacy systems. It's not that legacy systems are inherently worse than no, that's a lie. Legacy systems are inherently worse than modern systems, but it's also because legacy systems have been around longer. People have built more on top of them. There's more complexity around them. People have had more time to look at them, and suddenly the technical debt becomes more and more obvious, which is often why the new systems get built in the first place. And so security is actually just a manifestation, or security vulnerabilities are just a manifestation of technical debt. And with that, I will leave you guys. If you guys have any questions, I'll be probably just hanging around on this call for a bit longer. Yeah, hopefully you guys enjoyed. Hopefully you guys learned something. MonSec's links are all there, but I'm sure you guys all know that by now. Thank you for having me.